It's sponsored by the Campaign for Peace and Democracy. My name's Tom Harrison, and I'm the co-director of the campaign. Joanne over here is the other co-director of the campaign. And before we begin, and I introduce the speakers, I'd like to say a few words about the campaign. You've all, I think, got a copy of our statement of purpose. It outlines our politics and the positions we take about a lot of recent issues. We started out in 1982 as the Campaign for Peace and Democracy East and West. And we were really inspired by the simultaneous emergence of the Solidarity trade union movement in Poland and the mass movement against nuclear arms in the West, expressed by the Freeze movement in the United States and European nuclear disarmament in Europe. The campaign formed around the idea of détente from below, an expression you may have heard before. It was coined by the British historian and leader of END, Edward Thompson. At that time, it meant promoting political independence from both Cold War blocs by bringing together grassroots movements for peace, human rights, and social justice on both sides of the Cold War divide. So, for example, we organized campaigns to enlist dissidents in the Soviet bloc to oppose Reagan administration policy in Central and South America. And we also got Western anti-intervention activists to support struggles for democratic rights in the USSR and the other nations of the Warsaw Pact. Our friends were in Polish Solidarity, Charter 77, the West German Greens. They included Jan here for many years, as well as others who played important roles in the revolutions of 1989. Of course, we welcomed in 1989 the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War, but what we hoped was that communism would be succeeded by the radical democracy that was always implicit in the long, courageous struggles of Polish Solidarity and human rights groups such as Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. Instead, as we know, the former Soviet bloc very quickly fell under the sway of a savage, shock therapy capitalism and a servile allegiance to the imperial power of the US and NATO. So now, more than 20 years after 1989, we have a panel here that I hope will critically address the question, why? Why did it develop the way it did? What went wrong? And also, what are the lessons of 1989 for popular struggles today against political tyranny and economic oppression, from the Arab Spring and the fight against austerity in Europe to Occupy Wall Street? So with that, I will introduce the panelists. The format will be each speaker will speak for 20 minutes. Mr. Morandi will be translated. We'll have a little longer for that reason. And then the rest of the time will be taken up by discussion, in which, of course, the speakers can also participate. I ask you to limit your comments or questions, and you needn't restrict yourself to questions. Comments are perfectly legitimate. To 2 minutes, but if you go up to 3 minutes, that's permissible, okay? So 2 to 3 minutes. All right, the first speaker is Joanne Landy on my left. Joanne is as I mentioned before, the co-director of the Campaign for Peace and Democracy and a member of the editorial board of New Politics magazine, which there are copies here on the desk. There are also copies of the campaign's literature spread out over these tables. As CPD co-director, Joanne has traveled frequently to Eastern Europe in the 1980s. She's been expelled from some of the best countries in Eastern Europe. She helped mobilize U.S. peace and labor activists in defense of East Bloc dissidents and enlisted East Bloc dissidents in campaigns against U.S. policy in Chile, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. Then I'll just introduce everybody first, and then Joanne can speak. To Joanne's left is Jan, is it Kavan or Kavan?
Kavan.
Kavan.
Then it's to the left, yes.
It's an illusion.
It's just Czech, isn't it really? It's not what that's okay. Jan Kavan was born in London, but he was a Czech student leader in the 1960s, emigrated to England after this Prague Spring in 1968. He founded Palach Press as the press agency for Charter 77. He was editor of the journal East European Reporter. In 1989, he returned to Prague. He was elected to Parliament. He was foreign minister and deputy prime minister between 1998 and 2002. He was actually president of the UN General Assembly in 2002-2003. He's a member currently of the executive board of European Leadership, the European Leadership Network for Multilateral Disarmament, and he's a member of the Academic Council of Gorbachev's New Policy Forum. Lastly is Antonio Morandi, who is a journalist working for the Italian General Trade Union Confederation, CGIL, the largest Italian union federation. He works in Rome, for which he follows the politics of Central and Eastern Europe. He's a member of the Pan-European Regional Council in Brussels, which groups 88 European Union organizations. He also tracks the European Social Forum, the Joint Social Conference, and relations with European movements and networks. He is chief editor of the CGIL's newsletter and that of its left platform, Lavoro Società. Okay, so Joanne.
Adding gravitas to my appearance by putting on glasses. As Tom mentioned, the Campaign for Peace and Democracy was deeply involved in the 1980s in the struggle for détente from below, and we worked to build solidarity and mutual support between Western peace movements and progressive trade unionists and the democratic movements in Eastern Europe. I have to say we got some step in the Western peace movement for trying to do that, because, you know, I could just in short say, well, people said that if you're helping those people over there or supporting them, you're only helping the Cold Warriors, the Reaganites, and so forth with their militarization efforts. And we constantly argued that actually the best way for the peace movement and the left to grow would to be consistent in its support for democracy and its opposition to imperialism wherever it occurred. That we have, first of all, it would be the right thing morally to do, and second of all, it would give us greater credibility with the American people and to grow the peace movement. And we did succeed to some extent, actually a pretty significant extent, in winning people from our own U.S. peace movement, from the Frees, from War Resisters League, people like Dan Ellsberg, Ed Asner, Sojourners Magazine, to supporting, like when people in the Czech Republic, well, at that time Czechoslovakia, I just retrained myself to say Czech Republic, and I have to put myself back in time. When people were arrested, when Polish Solidarity leaders were put in jail, when Hungarians got in trouble, we would get all these people from the Western peace movement to sign on, although they had to think about it. It wasn't like a reflex. They had to think about it. But I'm really pretty proud of the fact that we did succeed to a great extent in getting people, at least some people, significant people, to engage in this. We also, well, I would say one of the big things we did about this was we took out an ad in the New York Times, saying something like, U.S. peace and labor activists support Polish Solidarity leaders on trial. And that ad was widely disseminated here and in Eastern Europe. But we also succeeded in getting East Bloc activists to support protests against U.S. policy in Nicaragua or Chile or wherever, and we got an ad in the New York Times also saying peace and human rights activists, East and West, oppose U.S. policy in Nicaragua. And I'm giving these New York Times as just, I mean, that was the biggest splash we did in anything, but we did lots of campaigns and were published in a lot of the publications here, and also, as Jan would confirm, they were pretty widely spread around in Eastern Europe. So we actually, the Cold War ended, and contrary to what most people thought, peace did not descend on the world. It did not end the need for a peace movement. And we're very much involved in that peace movement today. And we carry on that same tradition of opposing our own government, its imperial adventures, of which there have been really an obscene number in the post-Cold War period, and also supporting democratic movements and movements for social justice every place, whether they occur within the U.S. orbit, in countries like Egypt or Tunisia or whatever, or if they occur in countries that are hostile to the U.S. or the U.S. is hostile to, like Iran. And we encounter many of those same qualms in the peace movement. Well, if you support those people in the Green Movement in Iran, aren't you just giving ammunition to the warriors here? And we basically give the same answer. Those movements, those democratic upsurges, are really our people. They're like us. We're the ones who have a right to make the moral claim of solidarity, the demagogic hijacking of those movements rhetorically by people who are using them to justify their own imperialist thing that's hypocritical, but we can't say it's hypocritical unless we're consistent ourselves. So within that framework of building solidarity with movements for wherever they occur, movements for democracy and social justice, there's a question of how to do that. And that's really what I wanted to discuss. And we sort of organized this panel at the last minute, but it forced me to try and put together some of my own thoughts about what solidarity means for movements with movements in other countries. Does it mean automatic agreement with everything the leadership of these movements says? Does it mean like a rubber stamp for whatever they say? Isn't sort of the argument that if you're going to support people, does that mean you should not raise any troublesome questions? Well, we don't think so. And frankly, if I look back on the solidarity that we did during the Cold War, I would, in retrospect, have been more loudmouthed about my disagreements with what some of them thought. Then I mean, we did disagree, but we mainly argued with them about disarmament, and not so much about what kind of future society was going to come about if they won. Now, there's a very interesting article in here in New Politics magazine, which both Tom and I are on the editorial board of, by Danny Postel, called "The Green Movement, Critical Solidarity and the Struggle for Iran's Future." And in it, he discusses the term which I gather was coined by Fred Halliday, of the notion of critical solidarity, which is exactly what I'm saying here, of not meaning you're a rubber stamp or a cheerleader. You're completely militant in your defense of these movements and their rights, and in defending individuals who were victimized by regimes. But you need to have your own point of view. I'd say part of the reason in our own defense about why we weren't as energetic in critical discussions with our East European friends was that we didn't actually, I think, emotionally believe they were going to win. I mean, and frankly, I don't think they did either. I mean, that it's easy to sort of sneer at the pundits who were so surprised, oh my goodness, but I have to admit we didn't. I mean, we said it, and we believed it on some level. Well, communist regimes are not forever, totalitarianism isn't a permanent thing, there are people struggling now, new possibilities are possible, but when it actually happened, as we recall, it happened pretty quickly, and none of us, I think, were really prepared for the fact that people who we had been in dialogue with and defended in the prison and so on were going to be in power or next to power within months. And but I've learned something from that, which is, now when we're in solidarity with other movements, we have to be, I think, probing with them as allies about what the future brings. And I did have the advantage of reading Jan's speech before he's giving it, so I know some of the things he's going to say. And that also helped me in preparing. He didn't see my talk, so, but I'm giving it before him. There's a natural tendency in these movements that are struggling against tyrannical regimes for unity. They have a formidable enemy. There are always attempts by the regime to split people and divide them. They need each other, they need to defend each other. And so it's natural for them to kind of suppress their own differences, perhaps among themselves, maybe you can tell us that, Jan, but certainly publicly. They don't want to look like they're at sixes and sevens. And it's reasonable, and we see the same thing under less repressive conditions here, too. There's a tendency not to wash your dirty linen in public, so to speak. But I think the price of doing that is very heavy, because it means that, first of all, within the movement, clarity and about different goals, different futures doesn't get discussed. And perhaps even more important, the population, to the extent that it's exposed to these movements, doesn't see what the differences are and what the possibilities are. And so I think that that we, you know, of course, if you're not in the country, you don't want to go around saying, you people, we know better than you, you should do X, Y, and Z. But I think we should think of ourselves as participants in an international discussion about what the future is, respecting, of course, that people in any individual country are going to make their own decisions about what to do, but it doesn't mean that we're only there to defend people. We're there to participate in a common dialogue about the future. So one of the big questions that has bedeviled me ever since 1989 is why the East Bloc dissidents, who for the most part in the 1960s and 70s were on the left, either social democratic left or to the left of that. That is, they were socialists in some sense of the word. And why is it that by 1989 there was not really any substantial element posing a left-wing alternative? I mean, perhaps you could argue that in East Germany there was more of one. Eric and I were talking on the train on the way here. But really, as far as I know anyway, maybe I missed something, there was not really a discussion. There was not really a presence of a left option as these communist societies imploded. So I have some theories which I'll briefly share, and I'd be interested in what the other speakers and the audience thinks of them. Why was the left so weak by 1989? Why was the left in Eastern Europe so weak? So I think, first of all, we have to, be fair. I mean, the global left was pretty weak by that time. And so, it's natural that people in any particular country who are leftists are going to be weaker or disillusioned. If globally, if you're in a world that's dominated by Reagan and Thatcher and Kohl, and in which the idea of socialism has been discredited by the horrors of communism, the left wasn't very strong anywhere, so we shouldn't just say what happened to you guys. Second of all, I think that the advance of globalization, which we now are fully cognizant of, but which was already well advanced by the 1980s, I think is part of what contributed to the weakness of the global left, because it's hard to get your hands on, 10 minutes left, okay. It's hard to get your hands on a system when the capitalists, if workers in a particular country are getting too much money, they just go somewhere else. Okay, that wasn't so true before the 80s or so. I mean, the globalization of the economy, I think, helped, whether we knew it or not, to weaken and confuse the global left. Not because the people in Eastern Europe were so much living under globalization, although that too was advancing in the 80s. They were becoming more integrated to some extent by the IMF and the world economy. But more importantly, I think, was the disorientation of the Western left not knowing how to deal with a globalizing capitalism. Okay, so those are two reasons that are sort of related. And the third reason why I think there wasn't so much of a left option in Eastern Europe was that the left in most Western countries wasn't there for them, for the most part. I mean, there were unions, I know, and I don't mean just Cold War unions like in our country, but there were unions in Sweden and, that contributed to Polish solidarity and so forth. There were expressions of solidarity from European nuclear disarmament and the people that we rounded up and so forth. But in a broad sense, when I went to Eastern Europe, I would often be going to a meeting after somebody from some Cold War outfit had just been there the week before, and offering them lots of resources, lots of money, lots of support. And the global left was very nervous about that, and so that it was a leap for people to be as present as they should have been. And I think that's part of why, I'm not saying it's the only thing, but I think that's part of why there wasn't a left option in Eastern Europe in 1989. Okay, I'm not trying to say that if all of our movements had been out there for them, and if the dissidents had maintained their left-wing ideology, that it would have been automatic or easy, that you would have had a left-wing outcome in 1989. It might have still been not, that those hopes might not have been realized. But I think we have to keep in mind what the atmosphere was in 1989, the incredible moral and political standing that those revolutions had. And if they had said, we want to have full employment, we want to not have massive privatization, we want to keep some of the things that the old regime has offered, but democratize them. And if they had said no to the World Bank and the IMF, well, what would have happened? I don't know. They might have had to compromise. They might have had to concede things. You think back to the net, for example, in the time after the Russian Revolution. It's not a question of standing firm and not making any compromises, but the standpoint was an embrace of what was seen as normal capitalism, giving up, not resisting the shock therapy, and IMF and World Bank nostrums, but for the most part, the visible, articulate people from Eastern Europe embraced those things and embraced their logic. And so I think that we're all in a very serious, even grim situation today with what's happening with the unemployment and the race to the bottom, and things are being lost that we thought were permanent. And the problem of reconstructing a left in any one country, much less globally, is daunting. But I think we have to realize that kind of hopefulness that came in 1989 is something that we saw again with the Arab Spring. We had a flavor of that. And to the extent that we're aware of the obstacles that world capitalism places on people and the need, the heightened need for solidarity and a common program, the better off we're going to be. I think a couple of the issues that we're going to face is, again, I know that Jan's going to talk about this if he gets to talk about everything the city knows, which he won't, but one of the problems that we face is the anti-politics, which we first saw in Eastern Europe, that is a rejection of traditional political thinking. I have 5 minutes left, good. And we see this now in the Occupy movement as well. And it's for good reason. People are very, reject politics as usual, reject the cynical and corrupt politics of the establishment. But we see now in country after country, not just here, but in Spain or in Greece or wherever, we see the rejection of politics going to the point where people don't have an alternative to present to these awful governments they face. And so you have the paradox that, you have these inspiring demonstrations in Greece or Spain or wherever, and then you have these technocratic and right-wing governments taking their place. I'm not saying that to say we shouldn't go into the streets. I'm saying that I think we need, in our own way, just as much as they needed in their way in 1989, we need to have give some thought now to a program both immediate and visionary for how to move in an anti-capitalist and democratic direction. And I think that a part of that means finding a language to express the idea of socialism in, as what I mentioned before, in a world in which it was terribly discredited by what the communist system put forward. Luckily, though, we do see now these opinion polls in the U.S. that show that, especially among young people, socialism seems like a kind of good option. And what do they think socialism is? Who knows? But they capitalism is getting into bad odor, rather, and I think it's up to us to find both language and concepts to say that really we need to democratize the economy as well as the political sphere. As a matter of fact, we won't be able to keep the democratic political sphere if we don't democratize the economy. Thank you.